900 years ago, in a city built for 80,000 people, a baker sealed 5 clay jars and walked away. He never came back. Ani, the city of 1,001 churches, would soon stand empty. But those jars, they just gave up their secret. Picture this for a second. You're standing in the ruins of a city so big it once rivaled Constantinople and Cairo, and today, almost nobody has heard its name. The wind moves through empty streets where a marketplace used to roar with noise. And beneath your feet, sealed in the earth for 9 centuries, sit 5 giant storage jars, untouched, unopened, waiting. This year, archaeologists finally opened them. What they found inside doesn't just tell us what medieval merchants ate. It tells us how an entire civilization solved the same problem your grandmother solved in her root cellar, and the same problem you solve every time you check the expiration date in your fridge. How do you keep food alive long enough to survive the winter, or the siege, or the drought, or the year the harvest fails? Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to look at your own pantry a little differently. Who built Ani? Let's set the scene properly, because Ani deserves it. Today, Ani sits on the border between Turkey and Armenia, a windswept plateau of crumbling churches and broken walls that most travelers drive right past. But rewind to the 10th and 11th centuries, and you're looking at one of the great cities of the medieval world. Ani was the capital of the Bagratid Armenian kingdom, perched on a natural fortress of ravines along the Silk Road. Merchants called it the City of 1,001 Churches, and that wasn't just poetic exaggeration. Cathedrals, monasteries, and chapels rose on nearly every corner, funded by a population that, at its peak, may have topped 100,000 people. For comparison, that's larger than London was at the same moment in history. Then, in the 11th century, the city changed hands. The Seljuk Turks, a rising power sweeping out of Central Asia, took Ani and folded it into their empire. And here's the part that matters for our story. The Seljuks didn't burn the marketplace down. They expanded it. Notice what that tells you. Ani wasn't just a fortress or a religious center. It was a machine for trade, silk moving west, textiles moving east, spices, metalwork, and grain changing hands in a bazaar that, in its day, would have sounded like a stock exchange crossed with a street festival. And every great trading city runs on one thing that never makes it into the history books: food storage. You can build the most magnificent cathedral in the world, but if the granary runs dry in February, none of it matters. That brings us to the discovery. The discovery. In the summer of 2026, a team of archaeologists excavating Ani's old Seljuk-era bazaar uncovered something that stopped the dig in its tracks: 5 enormous ceramic storage jars, still sitting in what used to be a dedicated food storage structure just off the marketplace. Now, imagine the moment you're the archaeologist brushing away 900 years of dust and your trowel hits ceramic. You don't know yet what's inside. Could be nothing, could be everything. That tension, that not knowing, that's exactly what pulled these researchers back to this site season after season. The jars themselves are massive, the kind of vessels that would have needed 2 or 3 people to move when full. Some were sunk partway into the floor to keep their contents cool, a trick that predates refrigeration by, well, all of recorded history. Around them, researchers found the layout of a storage room clearly built into the commercial heart of the city, not a private home, but a functional part of the bazaar's infrastructure. Here's why that detail matters so much. This wasn't one family's emergency stash tucked under a floorboard. This was commercial-scale food storage, built by people who understood something we tend to forget in the age of 24-hour grocery stores. A marketplace only works if it can guarantee food will still be there next week, next month, next winter. Think about that the next time you complain about a grocery store being out of your favorite cereal. What was inside and how they did it. So, what actually keeps food edible for months in a jar with no refrigeration, no plastic wrap, no vacuum seal? The Seljuks, like nearly every pre-modern civilization along the Silk Road, relied on a handful of preservation methods that feel almost like folk magic today, but are really just brilliant low-tech engineering. Grain was the anchor of the system. Wheat and barley, dried properly and kept away from moisture, can last for years, which is exactly why massive ceramic storage jars, called kup in Turkish, show up again and again at sites like this one across Anatolia. The ceramic itself did a lot of the work. It's naturally insulating, it keeps out pests and rodents better than sacks or baskets, and when partially buried, the surrounding earth acts like a passive refrigerator, keeping contents several degrees cooler than the summer air above. Salt was the second pillar. Salting meat and fish pulls out the moisture that bacteria need to grow. It's the same chemistry your great-grandmother used to cure a ham, just scaled up to feed a city. Along the trade routes running through Ani, salt wasn't a seasoning. It was a survival technology, valuable enough that entire trade networks existed just to move it from mine to marketplace. And then there's fermentation, pickled vegetables, fermented dairy, even early forms of what would eventually become yogurt, a food historians believe has roots in exactly this region of the medieval world. Fermentation does something almost paradoxical. It uses good bacteria to crowd out the bad ones, turning spoilage into preservation. Put those three techniques together: dry grain in insulated jars, salt-cured proteins, and fermented perishables, and you've got a system that could feed a Silk Road marketplace through an Anatolian winter, an earthquake, or a siege. There's also a quieter piece of engineering here that's easy to miss: placement. Archaeologists found this storage structure positioned right off the bazaar's main thoroughfare, not hidden away, not buried in a back alley. That's a deliberate choice. Food storage on this scale was civic infrastructure, as important to the functioning of the city as the roads or the city walls. Whoever managed that room held real power. Control the grain, and you control whether the bazaar survives a bad harvest year. Now, here's the detail that should give you chills. We still use every single one of these methods today. That jar of pickles in your fridge, the salt in your kitchen cabinet, the bag of rice in your pantry. You are, in a very real sense, running the exact same survival software that kept a Seljuk bazaar alive 900 years ago. The technology changed, the logic never did. A day in the bazaar. Let's bring this to life for a second, because it's easy to talk about storage jars and forget there were real people standing next to them. Imagine you're a merchant walking into Ani's bazaar on an ordinary morning in, say, the year 1100. The air smells like wood smoke, animal hide, and crushed spices carried in from caravans that have traveled for weeks. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer rings against metal. Someone is arguing, good-naturedly, probably, over the price of salt. You walk past the storage building we've been talking about, and you know exactly what's inside without looking. This season's grain, packed tight in jars sunk into the cool earth, rationed carefully by whoever manages the bazaar's supply. That knowledge, the simple certainty that food will be there tomorrow, is what lets you focus on your actual trade. Textiles, silk, whatever you've hauled here from hundreds of miles away. That certainty is fragile, though, and Ani's story is ultimately a story about what happens when it breaks. Because for all its wealth, all its churches, all its clever storage jars, Ani didn't last. A massive earthquake struck in 1319, and it never fully recovered. Trade routes shifted. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century had already battered the region. Piece by piece, the city that once held 100,000 people emptied out, until by the 17th century Acne was essentially abandoned, a ghost city on a windswept plateau, left to the elements. And somewhere in that slow unraveling, someone sealed those 5 jars for the last time and simply never came back for them. We don't know why. Maybe the owner died. Maybe the bazaar shut down faster than anyone expected. Maybe, in the chaos of a city in decline, 5 jars of grain just stopped mattering compared to everything else that was falling apart. That unanswered question is honestly the most human part of this whole discovery. Because haven't we all left something behind, assuming we'd come back for it, and never did? Notice how quickly the calculation flips. One generation, food storage is the most important infrastructure in the city, guarded, maintained, replenished every season without fail. The next generation, it's abandoned mid-use, jars still full, and nobody left to explain why. That's not a gap in the historical record. That's the historical record. Civilizations rarely end with a bang. They end with someone forgetting to come back for the jars. Why this still matters. Here's what I keep coming back to with stories like this one. We tend to think of food security as a modern phrase, something for economists and government reports. But the people of Ani were solving the exact same problem, with the exact same stakes. No food storage meant no city. No city meant no cathedrals, no trade, no Silk Road wealth, no 1,001 churches. Every civilization that's ever mattered has had to answer one unglamorous question first. How do we keep everyone fed between harvests? Ani answered it with ceramic jars, buried cool, packed with grain and salted meat and fermented vegetables. You answer it with a refrigerator, a pantry, and a grocery delivery app. The tools evolved. The problem, and the ingenuity it demands, never went anywhere. And maybe that's the real secret those 5 jars were holding. Not a hidden treasure, not a lost language. Just proof that the most ordinary act imaginable, storing food for tomorrow, is one of the oldest, quietest threads connecting us to people who lived 900 years ago in a city most of us had never heard of until today. So next time you organize your pantry, or can a jar of tomatoes from your garden, or salt a piece of meat, you're doing something that connects you directly to a Seljuk merchant in a marketplace that no longer exists, in a city that time nearly erased. If this kind of forgotten history is your thing, subscribe, because next week we're heading back underground into a hidden ritual chamber sealed for over 1,000 years, and what was found inside might be even stranger than 5 jars of grain. Until then, I'm Russell, and this has been Secrets of Yesteryear.